So I'm going to just kind of go over today some of the guidance, particularly as it relates to next year, in terms of the attendance accounting that TEA has sort of described so far. I'm going to give a little bit of a federal funding review and update, and then I'll talk a little bit about sort of the state budget picture and what we can expect next session. So just to kind of recap on some of the guidance that's been put out on how your ADA calculation is going to work next year. For 2021, we know that it's going to, instead of just one ADA number, right, usually it's just your in-person ADA that gets calculated and sent to the state. Now it's going to be essentially 4 different ADA numbers that will be added together to get a total ADA. And I'm actually going to come back to that second point there about private school or homeschool kids as once we start talking about the remote ADA. Yeah, I'll table that for now. But just know, big picture, the ADA calculation has gotten a little bit more complicated, and there's now different sort of funding, different sort of way you're going to pull different streams together to get your total ADA next year. So as I mentioned, there's 4 methods of instructional delivery. We know about on-campus, and we know about the Texas Virtual School Network. But those 2 on the right, they are new. There's remote synchronous and remote asynchronous. And remote synchronous is sort of kind of like what we're doing now, right? Like via Zoom or sort of real-time interaction. Remote asynchronous would be, this is something that I know my kids did with the district that we're in. There's different ways to do it, but essentially a teacher would post assignments or some sort of materials, a video that students can watch at any time. And then the students would then submit up completed work to that system. It can also be done non-virtually, right? Like paper packets. And I'm sure y'all are kind of familiar with that process from the spring. So that's kind of how the state is thinking about in terms of funding. There's separate requirements for each type of remote instructional delivery, and we're going to kind of get into those now. So with synchronous instruction, the attendance is going to work much like it does on campus. There'll be whatever designated attendance taking time there is, and this will be per your plan that your district develops. But whatever's designated as attendance taking time, students that are logged in at that time will be counted as present remote synchronous for the day. For asynchronous, the attendance is not going to be based on a particular time, because students can interact with that material at any point throughout the day. And if you heard on the commissioner call today, earlier this morning, he mentioned that you essentially have 24 hours to get kids, to allow them to essentially demonstrate progress. And so they can submit an assignment, later that night or, early in the morning. And so that should provide some, it doesn't have to be within your normal operational hours. And so hopefully through your learning management system, there'll be some sort of timestamp that then you can make sure you're allocating that progress to the correct day. But it's important to note that with asynchronous, they do have to demonstrate progress or complete those assignments each day to be funded. You can't, like I'm thinking back to personally my experience during the spring, on days when I was available, me and my kids, we may knock out a couple assignments on Monday and then maybe not do so much on Tuesday. Once fall starts, that will be, that sort of behavior would be detrimental to your funding, right? Because if the student is not demonstrating learning or progress in completing those assignments each day, that would not, there'd be some days in which the district wouldn't get credit for attendance. And so that's really important to make sure you guys are including in your communications with districts, if you guys, or your communication with families, if you are going to offer an asynchronous plan. And then another difference between the two plans is with synchronous, not all grades are eligible. So as you can see there, pre-K through 2, through 2nd grade, you cannot get synchronous funding. And TEA's thinking behind that is it's just not feasible to get those younger kids parked in front of a computer for 3 hours or 4 hours a day. And that's just not really instructionally ideal. And so they've limited it to grades 3 and up. And you can see there, grades 3 requires 180 instructional minutes. And then once you hit grade 6, it goes up to 240 instructional minutes for full funding. With asynchronous, there's not a specific face-to-face minute requirement. However, if you look on TEA's documentation, the sort of work that the students are submitting and sort of the curriculum plan for each day has to be roughly equivalent to 240 instructional minutes. TA hasn't really come out with exactly how they're going to be calculating that or ensuring that. I think we're going to get some more exemplar plans, I believe, today from TEA, and so that can hopefully give us some more information on how that process is going to work. But just because there's not a minute requirement with the asynchronous plan, that doesn't mean that it's still kind of there in the background. Your materials that you're asking students to engage with and the work that they're having to do, TEA in their guidance has said that it needs to be equivalent to the minute requirement for the synchronous side of things as well. And so the approval process is also different for these two. With the synchronous side of things, districts will be required to submit an attestation and ensuring that you're meeting certain checklists. If you can access the PDF version of this, this is clickable and it'll take you right to the attestation checklist. For the asynchronous side of things, first you have to submit a letter of intent. That's open now. It's very short. The commissioner sort of talked about that a little bit this morning on his call, and so you can submit that now. It doesn't take very long, but then after that, you would be required to apply for a waiver and submit an application, but that includes a more detailed description of your instructional plan, and that will be an intensive sort of process to develop. And again, like I mentioned, we'll get some exemplar plans, and there are some resources available on TEA's website kind of describing what the requirements will be for the asynchronous plan. And so hopefully your district has kind of started reviewing those and putting together a plan in place for that. And then lastly, the Texas Virtual School Network, I don't know how many districts here in Region 1 participate in that, but the funding for that, I mean, that will still function as normally. That is still an option. And the same rules kind of apply. You have to complete, to get credit for it, you have to complete the program and receive passing grade on it. And so if you use that, you're familiar with that, great. If not, and that's something your district is interested in, then you may want to take a look at sort of the rules and requirements for participation in the virtual school network. And so some of the requirements for this remote learning, as if you guys saw the emails that we sent out this week, to broadly speaking, to generate and get credit for remote ADA, the schools have to offer in-person instruction each day for every student in every grade level. Now, there are some exceptions, and those are kind of changing right now. I think we'll get, if the commissioner was correct this morning, we should get sort of more details on that, I think this week or maybe early next week. But some of the exceptions are listed there. If there's a state shutdown, obviously you don't have to offer the in-person instruction. If there's a partial or complete closure of the school due to an outbreak, obviously the in-person requirement it doesn't hold for that particular campus. One thing that's not listed here is and the commissioner touched on this morning, is you can close down that campus for up to 5 days, 5 consecutive days. You don't have to close it down for 5 days, and that's one point of confusion around that. 5 days is sort of the limit that you can close down and not get penalized. The third point there is one we've seen some movement on this week. The governor made that announcement on Tuesday, and I think we expect some further refinements to that from TEA soon. So it has to do with this start of school transition period. And so TEA has said that districts can limit access to in-person instruction for the first 3 weeks. That was sort of the original guidance. The first 3 weeks you can limit it, but as long as you offer remote instruction for all students, you can sort of phase in your transition to on-campus instruction. So just maybe limit it to a certain grouping of students the first week, and then sort of and then broadening that up. Of course, I know some districts in Region 1 are subject to a local health order, and so that's sort of been the new development this week, right? Is how does that apply, and are districts going to be penalized for following the local health guidance? As the commissioner addressed this morning, the answer seems to be no. Districts will not be penalized for that if you're following the local health order, as long as you're providing remote instruction during that time. The one sort of thing to stress here is in the commissioner's comments this morning, in the governor's comments, this sort of transition period can be extended beyond 3 weeks only if there's a local order. And so if you're in a county or a city that hasn't issued that order, it's not clear to us that you can extend that 3-week transition period. And so that's just one thing to keep in the back of your mind. I know for a lot of Region 1 districts, that's not, the county's already issued that order. But if you're not in that situation, you may want to reach out to your county and city officials and try and coordinate with them on that. Let's see. I think that next bullet point is actually addressed in the next slide. Actually, I'm gonna skip that next bullet point about how districts can require students to commit to instructional methods, because I think it's addressed on another slide in more detail. So let's talk a little bit about the hold harmless provisions. This is also another place where there's a lot of confusion, and it's pretty complex. So for those first 2 6-week attendance periods, the state is going to hold you harmless. And we'll essentially exclude those first 2 attendance periods if they're less than what you showed in 1920. And so if you're opening up, just given all of the uncertainty and how erratic attendance is likely to be, and as everyone sort of gets used to this, remote learning situation, as you're kind of ironing out those operational details, if you're seeing a large drop in your ADA during those first 2 6-week periods, just know that the state is going to sort of hold the line for you, compared, and the sort of floor that they're going to hold it at is what you saw in 1920. And then they're going to sort of calculate a historical ratio, sort of like what they did for 1920 attendance, right? We've all sort of worked with Omar's template and seen how, hopefully we're familiar with that calculation, how there's going to sort of shrink the your ADA based on sort of that historical ratio. They're going to kind of do something similar for 2021 and essentially look at your third 6 weeks through your six-week period in 1819, get a ratio, and then apply that to your 2021 ADA. For remote asynchronous ADA, like I mentioned, that's going to require a plan that TEA has to approve. And TEA is going to give you a grace period to get that approval through the first 3 6-week periods. And so they're going to open up the window to get those plans approved shortly, but the funding is not, if you don't get approval by the start of school, that's fine. You have essentially through the first semester of school to get those plans approved. And then after that point, if you have a plan that's not approved, that is when you will start seeing funding implications. And so there is sort of a grace period with the remote asynchronous ADA. TA has also announced that there's sort of a cap on your ADA, so almost a reverse hold harmless, if you will. The way this is going to work is, I guess they're worried about districts being able to, they're just sort of protecting the state and its obligations. Tied to, if there's a real big surge in attendance because everyone's on remote, and even if kids are sick, they can just attend remote. And so that may sort of increase the overall funding that's due to districts. And so what TA has done, and we're still trying to figure out exactly how this calculation is going to, what sort of the methodology for this calculation. But what they've said is for remote attendance, they're going to cap that based on your aggregate attendance rate for 1819. And so again, that just applies to remote attendance. So essentially you will not be able to have students you won't be able to get, let's say every remote, every student is is in attendance 100% of the time remotely. TEA won't fund you at 100% for all students. On your remote ADA. They're going to essentially fund you up to your aggregate attendance rate for 1819. And again, we don't know exactly how that calculation is going to occur or what that number will be for each district, but just know that there is sort of an upper limit to your remote ADA that the state is going to recognize for funding purposes. And then also, as I note there, the in-person attendance is not going to be subject to this cap. So if, there's not going to be some sort of ceiling on the in-person attendance that you report to TEA. And then again, if you do have this document as a PDF, these links are clickable and that'll take you straight to that ADA FAQ that TA has published. So here's sort of the points that I was talking about a little bit earlier with what the state is allowing you to require of students and families. They've said that you cannot ask a student or family to commit to an instructional delivery method until 2 weeks before the start of school. And then you cannot require students to commit to remote learning longer than 1 grading period. And so just keep that in mind as you guys are crafting sort of your communication with your communities, that's sort of the limitations that the state has placed on y'all. We have a question coming through. Let's take a moment to address that. Right, so it's more just a comment that the cap takes away from the efforts that you guys are going through to get everyone internet service, and I agree. TA hasn't really come out with a real clear rationale on why that they're instituting the cap. I think it's just, they are just potentially trying to cover themselves, potentially in the case that there is, really high levels of attendance remotely. And so it's unfortunate that they're doing that, but they've been fairly clear in their FAQ documents that they are going to institute a remote ADA cap that's based on your attendance rate. As we've seen with districts pushing back on things, that policy could change, as they've sort of shown with that transition period element. And so I would encourage y'all to share that concern with the agency, and we can certainly pass those concerns along as well. But that seems to be sort of the facts as we know them now.
Josh, on that one, I mean, it does seem kind of, well, contra that here are the 4 ways you can get ADA. Mm-hmm. This one is going to be capped. That really doesn't make any
right
for a lot of
yeah
stuff. So.
it doesn't. I totally agree, and it seems like the commissioner makes a point every time he talks about this that he's really valuing the students' instructional progress, right, and their engagement, and that to limit districts' funding. If a district knocks out of the park and does a really good job and gets everyone attending remotely at a really high level of fidelity, I don't know why it's in the state's interest or TEA's interest to not honor that commitment and that work. It does seem really at odds with what's best for students.
And CFOs and assistant soups out there, business managers, he does have Tuesday and Thursday meetings, and I don't doubt a lot of you are on those meetings too, but you definitely need to ask your soups to submit questions if your superintendent's comfortable with you submitting questions. But because obviously they've had to adjust and and change their plans, and it's evolving. I mean, it really mm-hmm. is. So that's one that I just don't see the reason for the cap, and I'm sure y'all really don't see it either, and nobody sees it. So, but right. I mean, I know that the state revenue side, but again, as it is, there's always been a concern about you. As it is, you don't fund us for enrollment, even though we've got to be ready for that enrollment. Mm-hmm. We can't help it when kids get ill or have the flu and stay home. I mean, none of the other expenditures change because of that, but the revenues change. Right. So anyway.
So just kind of wrap up this section. Districts, if there's courses that require certain equipment or have certain sort of instructional limitations, you can allow remote learners to visit the campus. And so, and the commissioner this question was asked of him this morning. How do we require students if their parents just flat out are refusing? And essentially he kind of shrugged and just said, that's a tough situation. And so I don't know how, I'll be honest with you, I don't know how that is going to work, but that's TA is in their documentation. They are giving districts that leeway. Another question came in about the commitment, sort of what you can require of students and families to commit to. The district has to commit to remote learning for each 6 weeks. The the point there is this is the commitment that districts are asking of students and families. And so what it's saying is it would be chaos if, well, it's going to be difficult anyway, but it would be even more chaotic if you had students, let's say, that are hopping back and forth every day between in-person and remote, right? It would be really hard to provide any sort of continuity with that kind of instruction. And so what TA has said is you can sort of tamp that down a little bit by requiring a student to commit to remote learning for at least one grading period. And then at the end of that grading period, if they so desire to come back in person, they can do so. But you can't ask a family to commit for the full school year. That's essentially the upshot here of that guidance is the longest period that you can ask a family to commit to for remote learning is a single grading period. All right, and then also just regarding those extracurricular activities, a district can develop a local policy that sort of, if you have students that is remote, you can limit sort of their access to in-person UIL activities. And again, that's sort of at the local level. That's up to your individual districts. All right, so that was a lot, and I know a lot of that is still fluid and changing, and you know, if you guys are working through these, you know, on the instructional side, if you guys are working through these plans and you have specific funding questions, you know, feel free to shoot me an email, and I can I always try and find, you know, the specific part of TA guidance that addresses that, and I can hunt down an answer for you. If you do have specific questions about how is this going to impact my ADA next year, you know, let me know, and I can try and get you those answers. And also, if it's not in the guidance, we're in regular contact with TA staff, and so we can help get you guys those specific answers. So kind of moving over to federal funding, a lot of this is review, and so I'm going to kind of move through this quickly. With the ESSER funds, you guys are probably pretty far along on coming up with a plan for, you know, what expenditures you're going to be using the Fund 266 on. One thing that's listed here there at the bottom is the equitable service requirements, and I did get some questions on this particular point from some Region 1 districts, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time on that. As y'all are aware, at the federal level, the U.S. Department of Education did issue sort of revised rule for how districts can calculate the equitable service obligation. And so, NTA has now updated their PNP FAQ to reflect that, and they've also posted to their YouTube channel a sort of new training that kind of walks you through that. And so if you haven't seen that, and you do think that there are some private nonprofit schools in your district, and this is going to be sort of an issue that you're grappling with, be sure to go and watch that training and make sure you look at that new FAQ. But essentially what it does is it gives districts more options on how they calculate that obligation under the equitable service requirement. And so if you're giving your CARES Act grant just to Title I schools, or using it for expenditures on Title I schools, you have some extra flexibility. And so that's just something, if this is going to be a concern for y'all, if you're expecting a lot of requests from private nonprofit schools, that may be worth your time. I will say, just given the decisions in Texas to supplant state funds with those ESSER dollars, I don't know how helpful these new options will actually end up being. It's going to really depend on the facts on the ground for your particular district. And so I would, if you do have questions about that, it might be best to handle that sort of offline. You can shoot me an email and we'll kind of walk through sort of how that may work, how that sort of, how those alternative calculations could work for your district and whether or not they would benefit you. Let's see. So then again, just a reminder that this ESSER grant, they are federal funds, right? And so as Corey Green and others at TEA have mentioned, the Edgar regulations apply. And so that, you know, types of things with procurement requirements, and, you know, if you're using it for staff, the job descriptions and all that. One thing that I have heard from TEA on that some districts had questions on is, if I code something to 266 and I attribute it and it's for a particular program intent code, does that count towards the direct spending requirement? And yesterday I got an email from David Marks at TEA saying that that is the case. So for sort of that direct spending requirement, gauging whether or not you met that, TA will include expenditures that are coming out of Fund 266 if they're coded to the appropriate program intent code. And so I know some districts are kind of concerned about that, but it's not. I don't have a part of the guidance to point to yet, but it's my understanding that TEA is going to be revising that and be addressing that question specifically. But just, you know, that was the directive that was sort of the opinion that was expressed to me from David Marks at TEA. So I think we should see that coming in the FAQs soon. And again, some of these other details about the CARES Act, you guys know, it's in the FAQs, but just that, you know, there's sort of a, you can attribute expenditures back to March 13th on that, and then you have until September 30th of 2022 to spend it. And of course, there's going to be compliance reporting and quarterly reporting that you'll have to submit because these are federal funds. And again, I won't spend too much time on this. I think we presented to y'all on this slide before, but just in case you want it as a reference, here's some examples of allowable costs. Particularly that 12th allowable cost there, that last bullet point in terms that's referencing continuity of services or maintenance of operation. I think that's going to be what a lot of districts, and just in conversations with districts, they seem to be targeting that allowable use as one that they're going to be marking on their application. And so, you know, I would just, if you're having trouble finding costs, I do think that 12th allowable use is going to be useful for you. And you can see the full, I've only pulled 3 of the allowable uses here. You can see the list of all 12 of them in the CARES Act FAQ linked there at the bottom. There are some unallowable costs that TEA has outlined. You cannot use it for construction. You can't use it for essentially expenses that are reimbursed through other programs, like child nutrition expenses through PDA, expenditures related to teacher unions or associations, executive salaries and benefits of individuals not employed by TEA or ISDs. That kind of struck us as we were wondering who that would apply to, but it's there in statute. And so if that is something you're considering, just keep in mind that the guidance and the USDE rules prohibit that. And then also bonuses, merit pay, and less related to COVID-19 disruption and closures. If it's merit pay that's related to the closure, that seems permissible, but otherwise, no, you cannot use that. You cannot use the ESSER fund for that. All right, so then switching gears to the Coronavirus Relief Fund. This is a separate pot of money. I also got some questions on from Region 1 districts over the past few days. This is going to work like a reimbursement program similar to the FEMA program. except a little bit broader in terms of the types of expenditures you can get reimbursed compared to FEMA. This was originally going to be run by TEA, and TEA sort of announced it. And then a couple weeks back, they since seem to have handed the reins over to the Texas Division of Emergency Management. I have reached out to TDEM to try and get some more information on that. I have not received any additional guidance on or details on how they are going to implement the program. So all of the stuff sort of listed here is from TEA's FAQ. And so once we get some more information from TDEM, we'll be sure to share that out with y'all. But at least what we know right now is the application is expected to open next week. Again, that'll be a reimbursement amount for 75% of eligible costs. In the announcement of this program, Commissioner Morath did say that 25% reimbursement share, how that's divvied up, it may be reduced if the state gets more requests for reimbursement than the around $300 million that they have budgeted for this program. And so that's something to keep in mind. Their sort of goal is to reimburse you at 75%, and that's what they expect to do. But in the event that, more than, $300 million across the state is submitted for reimbursement, they said that their sort of response to that would be to lower that reimbursement amount to be less than 75%. And then in addition, the reimbursements will be capped. So the maximum reimbursement that your district can get will be capped at the amount equal to the greater of $50,000 or $250 per CompEd student. And so that's just, again, something to keep in mind as you're trying to identify certain expenditures that are eligible and can be submitted. Just kind of keep in mind that that's sort of there is a cap on the maximum amount you can get reimbursed under this program.
Josh, there is a question in the chat. If payroll costs are allowable out of Function 11 and Program Intent Code 11.
Yeah, so, and I'm not sure if this was in reference to, Angela, maybe you can weigh in here real quick. Is this in reference to the Coronavirus Relief Fund or to the ESSER grant, ESSER? Yeah, so that is a question that we have submitted to TEA, and I've asked that of both Corey Green and David Marks, and we haven't got clarity on that yet. It seems clear to me that 12th allowable usage in the federal law, that continuity of services and maintenance of and continuity of services and operations, that would cover PIC 11. But just to be clear, we haven't seen TEA come out specifically and say yes on that. And so we're trying to get them to come out and in writing commit to that. I know many districts that I've talked to are planning on using those, are planning on using the expenditures that are coded to PIC 11 for this grant. And given the language of federal law, that seems permissible. But again, just want to reiterate that TEA hasn't officially come out and said that. And so we're trying to get them to do that. It's the right thing to do, to be perfectly honest. But they have not done so yet. All right. So these are, again, the rules with the Coronavirus Relief Fund. You guys are probably familiar with this by now. This whole program, just getting a sort of big picture understanding of it, it's designed to help you guys with those extra costs that your district had as you were rapidly trying to roll out your remote learning program. And so it's, again, has to have been incurred due to the pandemic. it's something that your district could not have been planning for prior to the pandemic. And so that's what that second bullet point gets to. It cannot be accounted for in the most recently approved budget as of March 27th. And then it had to have been incurred between March 1st and May 20th. And so that's sort of the bookends on that period. I know that there is a lot of effort being made to extend that May 20th deadline through the summer. I know a whole host of state representatives have submitted a letter to Abbott and Commissioner Morath on this topic, and I think even some federal representatives at the congressional level have weighed in on this as well. And I know many sort of education groups here in Texas have submitted letters for that as well. So that could be a point where we see some movement from TEA on and the governor on, but they haven't formally announced anything yet. But just keep in mind that could be something that's coming soon. And so yeah, that kind of covers the requirements under this program. Again, there are sort of similar to the ESSER grant, there are costs that are allowable under this and costs that are not allowable. This program is a little bit more narrow than ESSER, right? A little bit more broad than FEMA. And so the kinds of costs that this program is really targeted towards is those remote learning costs. If you had to buy devices or hotspots or that kind of thing to facilitate your remote learning program in the spring. And then also that second bullet point addresses sort of the payroll and benefit costs for staff that was sort of responsible for developing those online learning capabilities. And so you can also have that group of expenditures reimbursed under this program. There are some things that are unallowable, specifically, again, costs that are reimbursable under other programs. They've listed payroll for costs for employees whose work duties are not substantially dedicated to mitigating or responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. Damages covered by insurance are not allowable. And then you can't, if you're getting something reimbursed from FEMA, you can't submit the 25% from your FEMA eligible expense. You can't submit that to the coronavirus relief fund. So here's just kind of a big picture. I think we might have shown y'all this before, but just in terms of if you're communicating with your superintendent or other people in your district, just kind of how these programs kind of work in tandem. This is maybe a useful sort of high-level summary of that. And so again, it just kind of shows you that FEMA is the most restrictive in terms of the types of expenditures that will be eligible. The next program, the Coronavirus Relief Fund, is a little bit more broad. It kind of focuses on those remote learning costs. There is that cap based on your number of comp ed students. And then even more broad is the ESSER fund. However, that's not new money, right? That's supplanting state dollars, and it is subject to those equitable service provisions. I'm gonna check real quick. We don't have any questions about, no questions came in about any of that, so I'm gonna keep on going. We do know there's another pot of money in the CARES Act, the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund. Part of that has been used to provide you guys PPE, which I think most of the districts there have received it or will be receiving it soon. I'm not sure what the remaining amount will be used for. I know the governor is rolling out that Operation Connectivity, that initiative that Morath addressed on Tuesday's call. And so potentially some of this money could be used for that initiative. One thing that has not been addressed, though, is according to federal law, we submitted this question to TEA, and they're kind of waiting on them to weigh in on. But those equitable service requirements that we talked about with the ESSER money, that applies to this pot of money for the governor's, the governor's pot of money. So we're not sure, with ESSER money, TEA sort of walked us all through this calculation on how you would figure out your obligation to private nonprofits within your district. But they haven't done that same sort of, haven't shown us how that's going to work with this pot of money, or if they're going to handle it some other way. And so that's just something to sort of keep in the back of your mind, that there may be some more information about what's required of us, as it relates to this equitable service requirement. So that's something that could be coming soon. And then, of course, another thing that could be coming is another stimulus bill.
Josh, before you
Yes.
move to this one, just a quick little FYI for the districts. We this morning started receiving the shipments of PPE for those of you that did not get direct shipments, which is the majority of you. And we're receiving more tomorrow. And so we're hoping by next week to get it all sorted by district and start asking or giving the districts a schedule on pickup of those items. But it is 6 truckloads, 18-wheelers worth. I don't know if you mentioned it, I missed it, how much the state did spend on PPE statewide of that 307. But anyway, that's where we're at. We're hoping that you will have all this in your hands and out of ours by next week, Lord willing.
I have not seen I don't know how much of that 300 million has been used already for PPE. I have not seen that figure yet, but I'm fairly certain that there is still some left over. I know part of that money can go to higher ed as well. And so, but I have not seen a complete plan. We've asked this of the governor's office, but they haven't provided it yet. We have not seen sort of a full accounting of how they're going to spend all of that $300 million. But we do know that at least part of it was used on the PPE. Okay, and so it does seem like that another stimulus package is in the works at the federal level, and it does seem like sort of both Democrats and Republicans are sort of in agreement that something needs to be done. They're sort of far apart on the scale at which it needs to be done, and that's kind of what's described there in those bullet points. But it does seem like both sides are sort of working towards an additional stimulus package specifically for school districts. So we'll just kind of have to wait and see what sort of how sort of the scale of that package, and then also what the state ends up doing with that money. It could be as kind of like our ESSER situation where they use it to supplant, but we'll have to just, there's too many unknowns at this point with the requirements around that package. And so that's just going to be something that we'll have to keep our eye on in the future. Then switching gears a little bit here to the state budget and sort of how their revenues are looking. Oh, for some reason my my graph is not showing up there. So I'm going to go to this slide then, which shows more of a sort of big picture view. Through June, which is the most recent data we have, we'll get more revenue data in the beginning of August. And again, the revenue that was announced on July 1st was for June collection. And so through collections through June, the state so far is about almost $3 billion behind the initial projection. And so if we take what happened in June and sort of extrapolate that out through the rest of the fiscal year, so July and August, that would result in the state ending the fiscal year about $5 billion less than they had originally projected. And so, that's not great news, obviously, but, in terms of, if you think about sort of the scale of the state budget, that is at least it seems manageable for lawmakers to pass a budget that sort of makes up for that without having to do real drastic cuts at this point. But again, with the numbers, the way the numbers are going now, and with potential lockdown being something that's discussed, another lockdown, that would obviously have economic implications and revenue implications. And so we're going to have to, it's still too early to tell exactly what the state's budget is going to look like when they come back into town in January. But at least with this fiscal year, sales tax revenues, which again provides most of the revenue for the state budget, it's not quite catastrophic. It's not good, but it's not catastrophic yet. So that, if Connie, you're asking for good news, that I think that's the best I can do right now.
We'll take it, Josh.
Yeah. And so as we've communicated this to y'all in the past, but through emails and with other presentations, state has asked agencies to present a plan for 5% budget cuts. A lot of the state expenditures were exempt from this request. So specifically, the Foundation School Program was exempt. The state's DRS contributions were exempt. The TEA as an agency, was not exempt. And so TA will have to make some cuts as a result of this request from the governor. And so in total, this is going to equate to around $1.5 billion in cuts to non-exempt services. We have asked TEA for their plan on what they're going to cut with this in response to this request. And it's even though this was due to LBB on back in June, they have not been able to provide us specifics on that. We've only got a very general description that just wasn't very useful at all. And so we're trying to get some more specifics on, okay, what sort of what kind of staff at the agency would, what kind of programs or staff could be cut at, as a result of this request. We have not gotten that information yet. And so when we do get specifics and sort of useful information from them, we will definitely pass that on. But just know that as we sit here today, FSP and TRS, sort of those big programs in the education budget, state's education budget, were exempt from this request. And so there has not been any discussion to make cuts in those areas yet. And so some other things to kind of keep on your mind from a state budget perspective. On July 20th, we will get a revenue forecast update from the controller at the LBB meeting. And we'll be sending out sort of a recap of that after once that occurs, kind of seeing how the controller, what his view is of the state's economy and of what he's thinking tax collections could look like going forward. And then in August, we will get legislative appropriation requests. Primarily, the one we're primarily interested in is TEAs, but agencies will begin to start reporting those to LBB and governor's office, and then they'll start holding budget hearings. And that's kind of where we'll get a sense of what lawmakers are thinking and what agency officials are thinking in terms of what their budget will be in the next biennium. And of course, this is just sort of a reminder of how the state has responded to revenue shortfalls in the past. We expect them to sort of first look for non-FSP cuts, to instructional materials or other items. And then, of course, we're all familiar with the regular program adjustment factor. You know, we all kind of lived through that experience. That, you know, that's something that could be considered next session. And then possibly any delay of new FSP elements, you know, created by House Bill 3. You know, the funding for those initiatives are something that could be delayed as well. So again, there has not been any discussion of cuts. Nothing's been proposed, but we're just kind of putting this out there for y'all to just kind of remind y'all what's been done in the past and kind of what some things that could be considered next session. And then just generally speaking, next session, there's a lot of other competing priorities and a lot of sort of unknowns. Just one, how they're even going to have a legislative session, if it's going to have to be done remotely, or if there'll be how they're going to implement social distancing requirements in the Capitol building, and just sort of how they're physically going to hold session. They haven't come out with their plan yet on that. And then of course we're going to get new leadership in the House with Bonin out. There will be a new speaker, which could come with new you know, committee heads and you know, other you know, leadership just generally. And so we don't quite know who is going to be put in those positions and how you know, sort of their views on public education, and so that's sort of an unknown at this point. And then, not to mention, there's just a lot of things that they're going to have to do next session. That, you know, obviously there's going to a lot of the bandwidth is going to be taken up by response to the public health crisis, but it's also a redistricting year. And so that's something that the legislature has to get done. That may be kicked to a special session after, but that is something that is going to require their attention. And then, of course, we've seen a lot of advocacy and demand for police reform, and so that could be something that sort of takes up a lot of the bandwidth during session. And so it's going to be a very busy session, and you know, a very you know, probably a very difficult session as well. And so that's kind of how we're seeing things at the moment.